From the first moment on the scene, we looked far beyond the walls of Nancy Guth's house. To be fair, coldness alone doesn't prove a crime. Both versions cannot be true, yet both highlight the location, whether before or after the mystery remains. Did that property create a window of time where illicit activity could go unnoticed by the neighbors? That uncertainty is exactly the kind of void we aim to fill as this case begins to tighten. Meanwhile, our forensic work continues. We have recovered DNA, but the process is far from straightforward. Mixed samples with multiple contributors take time until our analysts can successfully isolate each unique genetic profile. Without those distinct profiles, we cannot make comparisons. But once they are solved, everything changes. DNA does not just raise suspicions. It can physically place someone inside a controlled environment like Nancy's home. That evidence becomes undeniable if there is no credible explanation for why that biological material was there. At this point in our investigation, I want to ask you something based on what we have uncovered. What do you believe that silence in the days following the disappearance is actually telling us? But in a missing person case, behavior is a lead and we couldn't ignore the contrast. Give us your take in the comments. We are also working to see if physical evidence links multiple scenes. If that profile appears at multiple points on our timeline, the importance of that individual grows. It is no longer just about being present, it is about a calculated movement within a sequence. A link like that is impossible to ignore. It explains why a case feels stalled while we move forward. Digital evidence gives us a parallel map. Tracking cell towers is not just about finding one suspicious phone. We are searching for behavioral patterns across multiple devices. We filter massive data volumes, narrowing thousands of signals. We prioritize repeat appearances, unusual hours, and devices with erratic behavior during the most critical moments. If these devices appear on January 11th, the 24th, and then again when Nancy disappeared, the coincidence becomes impossible to defend. This pattern analysis is now the central axis of our investigation. A masked appearance weeks prior, another key date, and our focus on that nearby rental property. Before you and I go further, hit like and subscribe to stay on the trail of this case. The construction site analysis, the pending DNA, and repeated digital patterns within these critical windows of time. Individually, these pieces say little. But together, you and I can see a solid structure finally forming. We are no longer asking what could have happened. We are focusing on which explanation fits the facts. The turning point came when our investigation stopped expanding and started to zero in on a target. This phase is vital. It indicates that independent streams of information are beginning to point in one direction. In the Nancy Guthrie case, we realized the surrounding environment mattered just as much as the house itself. She did not vanish into a chaotic scene. She disappeared from an environment that felt entirely under control. There was no forced entry, no signs of panic, and no immediate disorder visible at the scene, suggesting what occurred was contained, executed by someone who understood the layout and limits of that space. That is why the neighborhood was vital. Catalina Foothills is not a place where strange movements go unnoticed. To understand why he became our main focus, we rebuilt Nancy's final timeline minute by minute. Routines there are stable and visibility is high. Anything out of place usually draws an immediate set of eyes. You and I have to ask how someone moved through that environment without attracting any notice. The answer we kept coming back to was familiarity, or at least the convincing appearance of it. That sequence of January 11th, the 24th, and February 1st seems to reinforce our theory. Instead of random moments, we see stages. An initial appearance, a second alignment, and the final event. This progression suggests cold intention rather than simple improvisation. Spontaneous acts are usually messy and inconsistent. In my world, impulsive crimes leave a trail. What we observe as investigators is a pattern within the same setting that simply isn't accidental. Time itself has become the pillar of this case. The camera feed cut out at 1:47 a.m. Her pacemaker flatlined at 2:28. That 41-minute gap is short, but plenty of time for someone with a mission. She had spent that last afternoon at her daughter Annie's house for what looked like a normal visit. To us, the lack of hesitation matters most. There is no sign the suspect wasted time deciding their next move. There was no second-guessing during the crime. The entire sequence feels surgical and efficient, which heavily supports our theory of premeditation. Digital footprints back this up, showing a chillingly emotionless pattern of behavior. Cell tower data reflects presence, movement, sudden stops, and clear shifts in routine. Devices that pinged on previous dates and then suddenly vanished or changed at critical moments aren't a smoking gun alone, but are highly significant to us. A phone leaving its usual network suggests a deliberate choice, either turning it off, moving strategically, or breaking a normal pattern. When multiple signals align, we start paying very close attention. Movement patterns have pushed our search efforts away from the suburbs and into remote, desolate desert terrain. If the digital breadcrumbs suggest an escape route, witnesses told us nothing seemed wrong. Later, her son-in-law drove her back to her Catalina residence. Our search teams aren't working blind anymore. We narrow the options based on distance, travel time, and potential concealment. This method is far more surgical and precise than any random search. You and I are looking at a calculated effort where geographic logic meets digital evidence. DNA remains the key. Mixed samples can be frustratingly slow to process, but they are often the silver bullet we need. Once we isolate the individual profiles, those genetic markers can transform a case almost overnight. That is why structured investigations often seem to go quiet, just as they are getting serious. The public drama fades because every conclusion must survive intense scrutiny before we can move forward. We now have a much clearer picture, a solid timeline with no signs of forced entry and evidence of controlled access. This is evidence that screams preparation. Digital patterns on key dates, movements matching the map, and DNA testing that is still currently underway. So far, we haven't found any reason to publicly doubt that part of the journey. This isn't a case drifting aimlessly anymore. It's structured, focused, and the net is finally tightening. Despite the progress, one truth remains. The same central question has haunted this case from day one. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until we finally have an answer, this case will remain a story searching for its resolution. If you have information, no matter how small our team, is urgently asking you to step forward. Anonymous tips can be sent to the FBI at 1-800-2324 or through tips.fbi.gov. A $100,000 reward is offered by the family and the FBI. While the mystery of Nancy Guthrie continued to grip Tucson, this became far more than just another routine missing persons investigation. What began as a private family crisis turned into a case watched closely by the public, the press, and the law. Behind the headlines, we are focusing on something much more disciplined. He claimed he watched her enter the garage before he drove away. That was the last trace of her. We focus on consistency. In a case like this, the smallest contradiction can be our most revealing lead. When you and I look at the timeline and compare statements against digital evidence, it becomes clear. This wasn't a disappearance defined by chaos. It was defined by total control. That distinction changed our whole approach. There were no signs of a panicked, forced entry. No obvious trail left behind, and no public disturbance to explain how a woman vanished from her home. It happened in a quiet neighborhood, a place that is usually very well watched. For us detectives, that kind of silence is often more telling than the noise. It suggests planning and a level of confidence rarely seen in random acts. Now, every detail looks different. A disconnected camera isn't just a glitch. A previous knock at the door isn't just an irrelevant event. A nearby property isn't just another house on the block anymore. After that point, the clock stops in a terrifying gap of information. It all points to one chilling possibility: someone knew the layout well enough to vanish without a trace. That is why we shifted away from general public speculation to focus strictly on technical precision. My team stopped looking for someone strange and started looking for behaviors that fit the emerging structure. In neighborhoods like Catalina Foothills, where routines rule anything unusual stands out to an investigator, the suspect needed a credible excuse to be there. Analyzing nearby construction and temporary jobs was my top priority. It was not about proving guilt yet, but explaining how someone could be in that space without raising suspicion. In cases with such tight timelines, knowing who moved unseen is just as vital as finding a motive. Everything revolved around that critical gap between 1:47 and 2:28:41 minutes in total. It was a short but significant window. For a detective, that interval reveals absolutely everything about the crime. That is enough time for a prepared predator to execute a sequence of acts without having to improvise. Her security camera died at 1:47 and her pacemaker sent its final pulse at 2:28 a.m. It was enough to enter, kill the visibility, and leave. I see no trace of confusion at the scene. There are no signs of prolonged chaos in the house, nor indications of a scene that spiraled out of control. On the contrary, I see pure efficiency in a criminal investigation that usually points toward a familiar face. It suggests knowledge of the house and the routines, trusting that nothing would interrupt the plan. At the same time, our interest in certain recurring dates only served to deepen the mystery for my team. January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st. These 3 points now look like a sequence, not isolated events. The public only sees the outcome, but as a detective, I know that is not where the story begins. We know preparation leaves discrete traces, like a common car or a face, seen in passing during a stakeout. These are fragments that seem to mean nothing on their own when we first find them. But when contrasted with the final chronology, they look like surveillance rehearsals or deliberate field tests. Our investigation narrowed in on the critical hours before she vanished on February 1st, 2026. That 41-minute window became our primary focus, suggesting the crime happened right then inside the house. This is why I needed the family to share every memory and camera recording, no matter how irrelevant. Every minute counts here. Any previous detail can be the bridge that connects our suspicion to solid proof. Meanwhile, the forensic side of my investigation continued to rely more on patience than on media breakthroughs. Mixed DNA does not provide immediate answers, but when it is resolved, its clarity can be devastating. That is why these cases seem to stall just before we take a drastic and sudden turn. Silence does not mean the case is cold. It means the evidence is being reinforced to resist any challenge. We see the same with mobile phone tracking. My agents are not just looking for a suspicious device. I study presence, repetition, and movements. A phone appearing on a key date might not mean much alone. A mobile phone appearing repeatedly in the same spot matters. A device changing behavior in that interval matters more. Patterns, not isolated facts, are what allow me to transform a theory into a solid structure. We weren't looking for a smoking gun. We were looking to see if the scene followed any logic. That structure is exactly what makes the Nancy Guthrie case so unsettling to those of us investigating it. There are signs of clear intent and planning that suggest this began long before she actually vanished. But one key piece of evidence is missing, one that is irreplaceable: Nancy herself. Without her, the case remains suspended. Her absence keeps the story open and the pressure on my department constant. That is why every request for information is urgent, as the answers remain incomplete until she is found. You and I are following an investigation that is currently moving in two very different parallel worlds. In the public world, there are headlines, photos, and a lot of speculation from outsiders. In my private world, timelines are tested and movements are mapped with extreme care by my team. If we prioritize structure over noise, then the silence in this case does not mean uncertainty exists. It could mean we are getting closer. We are now focusing our attention on the same dark shadow. It didn't. With no signs of a break-in, the theory of a random intruder was tossed out. That same doubt has loomed over every advance since the first day I took this case. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until that question is answered, the case remains unfinished and every ignored detail retains its power over us. If this investigation kept you attentive, leave a like and subscribe for our next case file. Before we go, tell me, do you believe that silence sometimes says more than any confession? I will see you in the next case. This suggested an intimate crime, someone who had a key or knew the security codes by heart. Then we looked at the surveillance system, and that discovery changed the entire direction of our search. We realized it wasn't a technical glitch. Someone used the correct credentials to remotely disable the cameras. That told us the suspect knew exactly how to manipulate the house's digital defenses. It wasn't just about who could get in. We had to ask who knew the home well enough to hide. At that stage, we moved to seize the vehicle used to transport Nancy that final evening. We didn't take the car because we thought it was the primary crime scene. In the gated community of Catalina Hills, an elderly woman simply evaporated from her home of 30 years. It was the last controlled space she occupied. Cars hide digital breadcrumbs that a human eye misses. As the media pressure built, it leaked that we were focusing our energy on the son-in-law. He was the key figure in our files, even though we hadn't filed official charges yet. But when the cameras find a suspect, the public narrative takes on a life of its own. Tension spiked when we saw him and Annie leaving their home, both hiding from our cameras. In isolation, those reactions could just be stress or a simple plea for a little privacy. It might have been pure exhaustion, but it fed a public perception that was already set in stone. Behind the curtain, we continued to move with absolute method and discretion. We started executing multiple search warrants across different locations. We cleared the house and took their devices. Then a massive update shook the entire investigation. I found no broken windows or forced locks. Instead, we found something worse, a chilling total void. We announced the family had been cleared of suspicion after reviewing the DNA and digital evidence. Technically, that should have quieted the rumors swirling around the town. But once the public decides someone is guilty, that suspicion is almost impossible to wash away. Our case split in two: the sensational headlines and the cold, hard data from the laboratory. My forensics team struggled with evidence that was incredibly difficult to pull apart. We found a mix of contributors, making the DNA profile much more complex to identify. Pulling a clean DNA profile from a contaminated sample takes more than just tech. It demands our patience and time. Silence doesn't mean the investigation has stalled. It usually means we've moved from the streets into the cold light of a lab. Simultaneously, my team mapped every local cell tower to track which devices were pinging near the scene during those windows. We didn't just focus on the night Nancy Guthrie vanished. A detective knows the real story often starts much earlier. The last person we could confirm saw her alive was a member of her inner circle, her son-in-law. We went back to January 11th and 24th dates that seemed minor then, but are becoming critical to our timeline now. This wider lens suggests that the events of February 1st were far from a random, spontaneous occurrence. If we find the same subjects near that property on earlier dates, we're no longer looking at luck, we're looking at stalking. Once we spot planning, our entire investigative focus shifts. We're no longer just asking what happened that night. It's about knowing when the sequence truly began. You and I are looking at a case where a family's plea met our data. They didn't waste time on rumors or wild theories. They pointed us towards specific windows, namely January 11th, 24th, and the night of February 1st. They begged for home security footage, insisting we scrutinize every small detail that might have seemed irrelevant at the time. In our line of work, breakthroughs rarely come from a perfect witness who saw the whole crime. That single connection immediately put him directly in our crosshairs. Sometimes it's just a neighbor who saw something odd and only realized its significance weeks after the fact. This case sits in the gap between hard evidence and uncertainty between digital footprints and the fragility of human memory. Despite all the evidence we've gathered so far, one mystery still haunts every step of our investigation. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Until we find her, every clue is just another fragment. If you know anything, no matter how trivial you think it is, we need you to step forward right now. You can reach out to the FBI at 1-800-225. 5324 or submit what you know at tips.fbi.gov. There is a $100,000 reward for information. You can stay completely anonymous. We don't need you to be certain, we just need the pieces you're holding. Your job is to give us the details while we build the actual criminal case. But it was his demeanor in the following days that really started to bother us. In a disappearance like this one, overlooked observation can be the difference between a cold case and a conviction. To us, Nancy Guthrie isn't just another headline in the morning paper. She's a real person, and my team won't stop until we bring her home and close the file. When we returned to Catalina Foothills for a second round of interviews, the internal compass of our investigation had shifted. To the public, it looked routine, but inside the precinct, we felt the circle beginning to tighten. Early on, we chased every lead in every direction. Eventually, however, the field of vision starts to narrow. That shift happens because certain clues finally start to carry more weight than the background noise of the case. Neighbors noticed our federal partners were no longer just asking broad, open-ended questions. We stopped asking if they'd seen anything strange and started demanding specific names during our follow-up visits. We needed to know exactly who was in the area and who had legitimate access to work inside the neighborhood. While our team searched the desert and helicopters scanned the horizon, her family was begging for any help. That kind of precision showed we were finished imagining every scenario and were finally narrowing in on the truth. We were focused on finding the person with the specific means to pull off a crime of this magnitude. Our focus narrowed down to two specific threads: a nearby rental property and the construction activity in the zone. At first glance, those details don't seem connected, but you and I know that operationally they are gold mines. Both gave a suspect a perfectly credible reason to be seen in an exclusive area like Catalina Foothills. In a tight-knit place where neighbors watch everything, the best way to avoid our eyes is to blend into the scenery. A rental house implies you belong there. Construction work allows a fleet of vehicles to move without raising a single alarm. My team is still examining a cluster of dates that are proving to be far more crucial than we first thought. January 11th stands out due to a documented incident. A masked figure showed up right at Nancy Guthrie's front door. There were no reports of forced entry or any physical signs of a struggle. His silence stood out. He didn't speak to us or show the grief you would expect in this situation. To an investigator, these early incidents don't look like failures. They look like a calculated dry run. In our operational experience, the opening move is rarely the main event. It is about gauging response times and vulnerability. That is why January 11th might be much more significant than we first suspected. Then we have January 24th, a date the family specifically asked the public to remember. While we have not shared everything publicly, highlighting this date suggests a very clear developing pattern. When multiple dates of interest surface before a disappearance, we do not treat them as isolated incidents. We start seeing sequences of preparation and perhaps a dry run. If so, February 1st was not the start. It may have been the moment that a much larger calculated plan was finally set in motion. That nearby rental property became a priority for us because the reports on it simply do not align. One account says the occupants left before Nancy vanished. Another claims they moved out immediately after.